He wasn't fighting to be liked. He was fighting to be heard. Fighting for dignity, for truth, for a voice that didn't ask permission. His words pierced through microphones like bullets, unfiltered, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. By 1963, he was the most feared black man in America, but also the most quoted in barbershops, prisons, and backroom strategy meetings. They called him dangerous. But was it because of what he said, or because people started listening? Crowds followed him, governments tracked him, enemies multiplied in the dark, and still he kept speaking. February 21st, 1965, Harlem, the last time he'd ever touch a microphone. But before the assassins, before the headlines, before the X, let's go back to the beginning. Birth in Omaha, 1925. Parents' political activism, Garveyism. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska. The fourth of 8 children in a household built on black pride and fierce independence. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a devoted follower of Marcus Garvey, whose message of self-reliance and African unity left a lasting imprint on the Little family. His mother, Louise, was a sharp, proud woman of Grenadian descent who managed the household with quiet strength and discipline. Together, they raised their children to speak properly, dress neatly, and never see themselves as inferior to anyone. But that pride made them a target in a country where black confidence was viewed as a threat. The Little family wasn't just poor, they were marked. Earl's involvement with the Universal Negro Improvement Association didn't sit well with local white authorities or white supremacist groups. The Ku Klux Klan visited their Omaha home shortly before Malcolm's birth, threatening them and demanding that Earl stop preaching Garvey's message. Rather than submit, the family fled Omaha for Lansing, Michigan, hoping for a safer environment. But the threats followed them. Even in the North, Garveyites were seen as agitators, and Earl's reputation for speaking boldly in church pulpits didn't fade. Malcolm's earliest memories would be shaped not by safety, but by the ever-present possibility of violence. His family never had the luxury of being invisible. Inside the home, Malcolm's parents did everything they could to instill pride and structure. Louise cooked from scratch, sewed clothes, and taught the children to read and write at an early age. Earl reinforced the belief that no white man would ever offer them freedom. It would have to be claimed. They didn't celebrate dependency, they celebrated strength. And even though the world outside didn't echo that message, Malcolm heard it enough at home to believe it had weight. But that belief would soon be tested in ways no child should have to face. The tension between what he was taught at home and what he saw in the world never left Malcolm. He was raised in a household that told him he was royalty, but lived in a society that treated him like a criminal in waiting. That contradiction would plant the first seeds of rebellion in his mind. Not the kind of rebellion rooted in chaos, but in clarity, the realization that something was deeply wrong with the way things worked. Malcolm's fire didn't come out of nowhere. It was kindled by watching his parents fight a battle no one else wanted to acknowledge. In 1931, when Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father was found dead on the streetcar tracks near their home. Official reports claimed it was a tragic accident, but the family believed something far more sinister had happened. Earl's skull had been crushed, and his body was nearly cut in half, details that didn't align with a simple fall. The Black Legion, a violent white supremacist group active in the Midwest, had threatened him before. Malcolm's older siblings remembered the threats clearly, and their mother never doubted that he had been killed for his activism. No arrest was made, and no investigation was pushed. The death broke the family's fragile sense of stability. Without Earl, the children lost their protector, and Louise was left to hold everything together. The life insurance company refused to pay out the full policy, claiming suicide. That accusation not only robbed them financially, it insulted Earl's legacy and left Louise desperate. She tried to stretch what little resources they had, but raising 8 children alone under a cloud of suspicion wasn't just hard, it was humiliating. Malcolm watched the strain wear on her face day by day. White social workers began to show up more often, always with questions that sounded like judgments. They didn't trust Louise's ability to manage the household, even though she was doing more than most would ever be asked to do. Her discipline and pride were used against her. They labeled her too proud and uncooperative, code words for black mothers who refused to bow. The system didn't want strength, it wanted submission, and Louise Little refused to give it. Malcolm didn't forget what it felt like to watch his mother fight against something no one could see, but everyone could feel. He didn't have the language for it then, but he understood what it meant to be punished for not breaking. His father had been killed for speaking, and his mother was being crushed for surviving. In those moments, the foundation of Malcolm's worldview was being formed, not by choice, but by force. And from that point forward, trust would be something he gave rarely. That loss never left him. By the time Malcolm was 13, the weight on Louise had become unbearable. Years of stress, poverty, and surveillance wore her down until the state finally labeled her mentally unfit. She wasn't given therapy, support, or relief. She was taken away. Malcolm and his siblings were placed in foster care, scattered across homes, institutions, and state programs. One moment, he had a mother. The next, he had a case number. Louise's commitment to a mental institution was not just a loss. It was a betrayal by a system that had worked tirelessly to destroy her. She had raised her children with rules, pride, and dignity, and for that, she was punished. The state didn't see a grieving widow. They saw a problem to be solved. Malcolm never forgave the people who made that decision. He believed they didn't just take his mother, they dismantled the only structure he had left. The impact on him was immediate and permanent. In foster care, Malcolm became both invisible and hypervisible. He was the black child who spoke too well, who asked too many questions, and who didn't know when to smile. Some homes were kinder than others, but none of them were home. The warmth, the safety, the sense of belonging he once had, those were gone. In their place was cold politeness, thin tolerance, and constant adjustment. He stopped expecting consistency from the world. Through it all, Malcolm kept a sense of himself that he didn't show on the surface. He learned how to nod without agreeing, how to follow rules without believing in them. Every new home was a lesson in performance. But deep inside, the pain of being separated from his mother and siblings lived like a shadow. It would shape the way he loved, the way he trusted, and the way he later raised his own family. That silence became part of him. In school, Malcolm stood out quickly, not for trouble, but for talent. He was a strong student with sharp reading skills, clear speech, and a confidence that surprised teachers. For a time, he believed he could be anything he wanted. That belief was shattered during a conversation with one of his favorite teachers. When Malcolm said he wanted to be a lawyer, the teacher didn't hesitate. That's not a realistic goal for a nit, he said with a casual smirk. The comment hit Malcolm harder than any punishment ever could. It wasn't said with cruelty, it was said with certainty, and that made it worse. The man truly believed that a black boy could dream big, but not that big. Malcolm realized then that no matter how polite he was, how well he spoke, or how clean his clothes were, the world had already made its decision about him. He wasn't a student, he was a statistic in waiting. After that, school didn't matter to him the way it once did. He started skipping classes, talking back, and slipping into the kind of behavior people expected from him. It wasn't because he had changed, it was because he had stopped pretending. If the system wasn't going to see him as capable, he saw no point in trying to prove it wrong. He wasn't bitter, he was done performing. That moment marked the beginning of Malcolm's departure from the path others wanted for him. He stopped performing for approval and started learning on his own terms. He became more observant, more strategic, and more guarded. That one sentence from that teacher didn't just close a door. It reminded Malcolm that the door was never open to begin with. From that point forward, he was done asking permission to exist, and that choice would change everything. At age 15, Malcolm moved to Boston to live with his half-sister Ella, a confident, independent black woman who gave him more freedom than he'd ever had. Roxbury was different from Michigan. It was loud, stylish, and fast. Malcolm took to it quickly. He got jobs shining shoes in nightclubs, watching how money and power moved between hands. He began dressing sharp, straightening his hair, and crafting a new identity. He was no longer a foster kid. He was Detroit Red. The street life offered something he hadn't felt in years: control. He learned how to navigate hustlers, musicians, gamblers, and crooked cops. He learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how to read a room faster than anyone else. In Harlem, he saw the city's pulse up close, black people surviving through hustle and instinct. It wasn't safe, but it was real. And for Malcolm, realness mattered more than rules. The persona of Detroit Red wasn't a mistake. It was armor. He built it to protect himself from the world that had stripped him down to nothing. The clubs, the flash, the fast money. It wasn't just about status. It was about creating an identity that couldn't be taken away by foster homes, teachers, or social workers. For the first time in his life, he was crafting his own story. He was performing for himself now. But behind the confidence, there was still a wound that hadn't healed. The boy who had watched his father die and his mother vanish hadn't disappeared. He had just been buried under layers of survival. And though Malcolm didn't know it yet, the journey that would one day turn him into Malcolm X was already underway. Not in books, not in sermons, but on the streets, where respect had to be claimed and identity had to be earned. That path was just beginning. Nicknamed Detroit Red for his red hair and street persona. By the early 1940s, Malcolm was no longer the quiet boy from Lansing. He was now known as Detroit Red, a name born from his light reddish-brown hair and slick, street-smart demeanor. In Boston's Roxbury district, where jazz clubs lit up the night and hustlers worked the sidewalks, Malcolm quickly made himself a part of the scene. He wore zoot suits, carried himself with swagger, and could talk circles around anyone in the room. It wasn't just an image, it was a survival mechanism, sharpened by years of being overlooked and underestimated. Detroit Red was magnetic. He worked in shoeshine parlors, nightclubs, and dance halls, rubbing shoulders with gamblers, musicians, and small-time crooks. He learned how to mimic charm, how to read people's intentions, and how to keep his emotions off his face. He wasn't interested in school anymore. He was interested in power, in getting what he wanted without asking for it. In every room, he paid attention to who controlled the money, who made decisions, and who walked away untouched. That attention became his new form of education. There was something intoxicating about being seen, especially for someone who had spent his childhood being ignored or pitied. In Roxbury, he found a sense of belonging, not in family or stability, but in image and control. People respected Detroit Red, or at least feared him a little. He wasn't trying to lead anyone or change anything. He just wanted to never be poor again, never feel helpless again, and never let anyone define him again. Everything about Red, the voice, the clothes, the confidence, was built to protect that. But the world he stepped into had its limits. The street economy wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on opportunity and luck. Malcolm was chasing fast money, faster attention, and a place in a world that felt dangerous but fair. What he didn't realize yet was that this persona, this mask he had crafted, would eventually lead him into something much deeper, a kind of destruction that didn't just strip you of money or freedom, but identity itself. As Detroit Red grew more confident, so did his appetite for risk. He joined a burglary crew that operated between Boston and New York, specializing in breaking into wealthy white homes. They used information from inside contacts, maids, drivers, even former employees, to find weak points and easy access. The jobs were quick, the pay was high, and Malcolm moved deeper into the world of crime without hesitation. He was no longer surviving. He was thriving, or so he thought. The money brought flash. He bought tailored suits, expensive shoes, watches, and even carried a pistol more for show than protection. He had a white girlfriend who drove the getaway car, and another friend who acted as lookout. The crew was small but efficient, and Malcolm took pride in being the one who never panicked. He planned carefully, stayed calm under pressure, and saw every score as a lesson in power. But the more successful he became, the more careless he grew. In January 1946, that carelessness caught up with him. After a break-in involving a stolen wristwatch and suspicion from a pawn shop owner, the police closed in. Malcolm was arrested alongside his white girlfriend and her friend. The legal system didn't just see the crime, it saw the color. A black man running with white women, stealing from wealthy neighborhoods. That made him dangerous in their eyes before the trial even began. The sentence was brutal. He was given 10 years for burglary, with no parole offered up front. It wasn't just about the crime, it was a message. The courtroom didn't see a misguided young man. They saw a symbol of what they wanted to crush. And just like that, the suits, the clubs, the power, all of it disappeared. The door slammed shut, and Detroit Red was gone. What came next would strip him down to nothing and rebuild him from the inside out. Prison was the first place where Malcolm had to sit with himself, without distraction. No fast money, no crowds, no false respect. Just walls, routines, and silence. At first, he reacted the way most men in his shoes did, with rage. He cursed the system, cursed the people who testified against him, and refused to visit with family. The world had turned on him, and in his mind, he owed it nothing. But over time, something shifted. Inmates around him spoke the same language of bitterness, but few seemed interested in changing anything. The days dragged, conversations looped, and Malcolm began to see how easily prison broke a man. The anger didn't disappear. It just stopped being useful. Sitting in his cell at night, staring at nothing, he began to ask himself questions no one had asked him before. That's when Bimby entered the picture, an older inmate who carried himself differently. Bimby read all the time, debated politics, and spoke like a man who knew who he was. Malcolm was drawn to that. He began listening to Bimby speak in the yard and in the library, and for the first time in years, he felt small in a way that wasn't humiliating. It was humbling. That smallness made him curious. He didn't know what he was becoming, but he knew he didn't want to leave prison the same man who entered it. The transformation didn't come with lightning bolts or revelations. It came slowly, through observation, repetition, and silence. But it came. The fire that Detroit Red once carried was still there. It had just found a new direction. The first book Malcolm opened in prison wasn't about race or religion. It was a dictionary. He copied it, word by word, page by page, just to train his mind to focus. At first, it was just a way to kill time. But the deeper he went, the more he realized how little he had known. Language became a new form of power. Every word he learned sharpened the blade of his understanding. After the dictionary, he moved on to history, especially Black history. He read about slave rebellions, African civilizations, and the brutal systems that had shaped the Americas. The more he read, the more furious he became. Why had no one taught him any of this before? Why had his schools taught him George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, but not Toussaint Louverture or Marcus Garvey? Philosophy followed. He read Plato, Aristotle, Kant, trying to understand how the world justified power, morality, and justice. He didn't agree with all of it, but he consumed it. His mind was expanding at a pace he could barely track. And in those books, Malcolm began to see the roots of the society that had locked him up. It wasn't just laws that kept men like him down. It was ideas. The guards noticed the change, so did the other inmates. Malcolm wasn't running scams or gambling anymore. He was reading, writing, debating. He walked differently. He spoke with precision. He wasn't trying to be impressive. He was just trying to be ready. Because something inside him said, "When I walk out of here, I'll never be invisible again." While Malcolm was remaking his mind, letters started arriving from his brothers and sisters outside. They had joined the Nation of Islam, a movement led by Elijah Muhammad that preached black pride, discipline, and a rejection of white oppression. At first, Malcolm was skeptical. He had seen too many preachers promise salvation only to exploit the poor. But the letters kept coming, and their tone was different. Less about religion, more about self-worth. His brother Reginald wrote with urgency. "Open your eyes, Malcolm," he said. "There's more to you than this prison." Reginald described Elijah Muhammad not just as a spiritual teacher, but as someone who gave black men the tools to reclaim their dignity. Malcolm listened. He began requesting literature from the nation. The teachings were bold, provocative, unapologetic. The nation said the white man was the devil, a term Malcolm didn't flinch at. To him, it matched his life experience. It made sense of his father's murder, his mother's institutionalization, his rejection in school, and his prison sentence. It framed all of it as part of a system designed to destroy black men from birth. That belief didn't make Malcolm bitter. It made him focused. He started writing to Elijah Muhammad. The responses were firm but encouraging. "Clean yourself, brother. Discipline yourself. Learn who you are." Malcolm took those words seriously. He stopped eating pork. He gave up cigarettes. He committed himself to the rules of the nation. The nation didn't save him. It challenged him. And Malcolm rose to meet that challenge. By the time Malcolm's parole came in 1952, the man walking out of prison wasn't Detroit Red. He had shed that skin. His name now carried a symbol, X. It stood for the unknown African name his ancestors had lost, stolen by slave traders and buried by generations of silence. Little was a slave name. He would never carry it again. The X was a statement. It wasn't meant to be polite. It told the world that this man would no longer apologize for his existence. It represented loss, but also power. Power to define himself. Power to challenge the world that had erased his story and replaced it with lies. Malcolm X became his new identity, but not just in name. His discipline, his hunger for truth, his rejection of comfort, all of it was sharpened by those 6 years behind bars. The Nation of Islam didn't just give him a new religion, it gave him a mission. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a weapon being forged. The streets hadn't defeated him. The prison hadn't crushed him. He emerged with focus, clarity, and a voice that would soon shake the country. Malcolm X had arrived, not by accident, not by miracle, but through fire, silence, and a choice. The choice to never be silent again. Mentorship under Elijah Muhammad. When Malcolm left prison in 1952, he traveled straight to Chicago to meet the man who had reshaped his thinking from behind bars, Elijah Muhammad. The encounter wasn't dramatic, but it left an impression Malcolm would carry for years. Elijah was quiet, soft-spoken, and deeply reserved, but what he lacked in volume, he made up for in discipline and clarity. He welcomed Malcolm with respect and a clear sense of expectation. If you wanted to represent the nation, you had to live like it mattered. Malcolm soaked in every word. Elijah Muhammad taught Malcolm that the Nation of Islam wasn't just a religion, it was a way of life. The message was more than spiritual, it was political, cultural, and personal. The goal wasn't assimilation, it was transformation of the black man's mind, body, and community. Elijah believed in building a nation within a nation, one where black men could walk with dignity, free from white control. That concept ignited something inside Malcolm. Unlike others, Malcolm didn't just hear the message, he absorbed it. He began traveling, listening to Elijah's lectures, copying his cadence, and studying his discipline. Elijah saw potential in Malcolm early, sensing that his past gave him a rawness that others lacked. What impressed him most wasn't Malcolm's intellect, it was his hunger, and with that hunger, Elijah handed him a platform. Under Elijah's guidance, Malcolm moved quickly. He was assigned to rebuild Temple No. 7 in Harlem, one of the nation's most important locations. What began as a quiet outpost soon became the movement's loudest megaphone. Malcolm became more than a student. He became the sharpest weapon in Elijah's arsenal. Their relationship wasn't equal, but it was powerful, and for a time, it was unshakable. It didn't take long for Malcolm to become the nation's most recognizable face. He wasn't just eloquent, he was electric. In every speech, every interview, every gathering, Malcolm spoke with conviction that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't interested in pleasing crowds, and he wanted to wake them up. Across the country, black men and women began to show up in droves. They listened as Malcolm talked about self-discipline, about rejecting the poison of white society, about embracing identity with pride and strength. He made people feel like they mattered in a world that said otherwise. Young men who had once roamed the streets aimlessly were now wearing suits and bow ties, standing in formation, ready to follow. And all of that was happening under Malcolm's watch. At every temple he visited, conversions spiked. He traveled to Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. Anywhere there were black communities ready to hear a new message. Malcolm didn't rely on theatrics. He relied on truth as he saw it, raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic. Even people who didn't join the nation couldn't forget the way he made them feel. Elijah Muhammad had been building the nation for decades, but it was Malcolm who put it on the national map. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a movement. His ability to explain complex ideas in plain language made him dangerous to those in power and magnetic to those with none. His presence wasn't a whisper, it was a thunderclap, and the world had no choice but to listen. At the center of Malcolm's message were the nation's core beliefs, ideas that challenged everything America had taught its black citizens. The nation preached that the black man was the original man, and that white people were a race of devils created to oppress and deceive. Malcolm repeated this belief with precision, explaining it not as hate, but as history. He pointed to slavery, Jim Crow, lynchings, and everyday racism as proof of the claim. He didn't soften the message, he sharpened it. Black separatism was not about hatred. It was about survival. The nation believed integration was a trap, designed to lull black people into dependence on a system that would never see them as equal. Malcolm echoed this everywhere he went. He believed that black people needed their own schools, banks, and businesses, not token seats at someone else's table. But beyond the ideology, there was a strict code of conduct. Members were expected to dress modestly, avoid alcohol, abstain from pork, and live disciplined, drug-free lives. For Malcolm, this was more than image, it was identity. He believed dignity came from structure, and structure came from respect for oneself and one's community. What separated Malcolm from many civil rights leaders of the time was his unwillingness to appeal to white sympathy. He didn't want pity, he wanted power. He didn't ask to be accepted, he demanded to be respected, and for that, he became both revered and feared. In 1959, Malcolm appeared in a televised documentary titled The Hate That Hate Produced. It was intended to alarm white viewers about the rise of the Nation of Islam. But for many black viewers, it was the first time they saw someone speak unapologetically about racism on national television. Malcolm didn't flinch under the cameras. He leaned in. He told the world that black people had been lied to, manipulated, and brainwashed for generations. He called Christianity a tool of white supremacy and rejected the idea that peaceful protest could dismantle centuries of oppression. He spoke in plain language, staring directly into the lens, as if daring America to answer him. For millions watching at home, it was the first time someone had spoken what they were too afraid to say out loud. Malcolm didn't just call out injustice, he called out silence. The documentary shocked the country. Politicians denounced the nation. Newspapers warned of radicalization. But in Harlem, in South Central LA, in Chicago, the reaction was different. People lined up to hear more. They didn't care that the message was bold. They cared that it was theirs. Malcolm used media not to please, but to provoke. He understood its power and wasn't afraid of backlash. To him, controversy wasn't a threat, it was a tool. The more the system recoiled, the louder he spoke, and the louder he spoke, the more followers the nation gained. As Malcolm's visibility grew, so did the hostility. The media didn't just report on him, they framed him. Headlines called him incendiary, hostile, and divisive. Reporters didn't ask why he was angry, they asked if he was dangerous. And Malcolm didn't shrink from that framing, he embraced it. He told journalists, "I'm not here to be loved, I'm here to tell the truth." He refused to play the role of the polite Negro waiting for progress. His sharp suits and sharper words didn't fit the image of the grateful civil rights leader. He wasn't asking for civil rights, he was demanding human rights. And the press didn't know how to contain him. Every time Malcolm appeared on television or radio, viewers either turned up the volume or turned it off in fear. He didn't smile unless it was intentional. He spoke calmly, but with razor precision. And while the media tried to label him a menace, Malcolm understood the real threat he posed: clarity. He made America confront its lies without apology. The media's fear wasn't about violence, it was about influence. Malcolm was building something that didn't need white approval. And that, to many, was the real danger. Behind the scenes, Malcolm's growing influence had triggered red flags within the government. The FBI, already watching Elijah Muhammad, turned its focus to Malcolm X. They saw him not just as a religious leader, but as a threat to national order. Agents began tracking his movements, recording his speeches, and infiltrating Nation of Islam temples. Surveillance reports referred to him as a key figure in black nationalist activity. COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert program targeting black leaders, added his name to their list. The goal wasn't to understand Malcolm, it was to contain him. They monitored his phone calls, intercepted letters, and planted informants in places he trusted. To them, this wasn't about religion, it was about control. And Malcolm was slipping out of reach. The more Malcolm spoke, the more files they compiled. He didn't call for armed revolt, but his refusal to embrace nonviolence unsettled the government. They feared his clarity, not just his rhetoric. A man who could rally crowds without touching a gun was more dangerous than one who held one. He didn't need a weapon, he was one. Malcolm knew he was being watched, and he spoke of it openly. "They fear me," he once said, "because they can't buy me." That truth echoed louder than any threat he could make. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding. He was just beginning. Tension with Elijah Muhammad, affairs, hypocrisy. As Malcolm's national presence expanded, so did the whispers inside the Nation of Islam. Stories began to circulate. Elijah Muhammad, the man Malcolm revered as a prophet, had fathered multiple children with secretaries inside the organization. At first, Malcolm refused to believe it. He defended Elijah privately and publicly, insisting it was a smear campaign. But the stories didn't go away, and eventually, they didn't come from outsiders. Members close to the inner circle began confirming what Malcolm had hoped wasn't true. The man who preached strict moral discipline was living by a different standard behind closed doors. Malcolm had built his life around those teachings: purity, restraint, honor, and now that foundation was cracking. It wasn't just personal disappointment, it was a spiritual wound. He didn't speak out immediately, but something in him shifted. Elijah didn't deny the allegations. He explained the affairs as being in line with divine instruction, saying past prophets had done the same. For Malcolm, that explanation was hollow. It felt like betrayal, not just of moral code, but of the very people who had sacrificed everything to follow the movement's ideals. His silence turned into quiet distance. Malcolm tried to contain his conflict. He stayed respectful in public, but behind the scenes, he grew colder. There was a sadness in his eyes during speeches, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just questioning a man, he was questioning a mission. And once the questions started, they didn't stop. The more Malcolm learned, the more isolated he became. Those loyal to Elijah began to treat him with suspicion, whispering that his rising influence might be a threat. Malcolm, who had once been the movement's fiercest voice, now felt like a target within his own community. He tried to ignore it, focusing on outreach and temple work, but the tension was undeniable. The brotherhood was fracturing. Some within the nation believed Malcolm had grown too powerful, too independent. He wasn't following instructions like before. He was thinking for himself. Elijah noticed it too. Meetings became colder, less personal. The bond they once shared had thinned into polite formality. Malcolm kept his criticism quiet, hoping Elijah would address the issue directly. But that conversation never came. Instead, Malcolm received veiled warnings, subtle reminders to stay in line. He didn't know who to trust anymore. People he had mentored now avoided him. For a man who valued loyalty above all, the shift was devastating. He still believed in the mission, still believed in discipline and empowerment, but his faith in leadership was breaking. He started asking himself a hard question. Can a movement survive when its leader won't live by his own rules? That question would haunt every decision that followed. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The entire country paused in shock, grief, and disbelief. Malcolm, when asked to respond, made a statement that would change everything. It's a case of chickens coming home to roost. He meant that America's history of violence had finally turned inward, but the press took it as callous, even celebratory. The fallout was immediate. Elijah Muhammad, fearing backlash, ordered Malcolm to remain silent for 90 days. It wasn't a request, it was a public suspension. Malcolm accepted the punishment, but deep down, it cut him. He had said what he believed, and now he was being punished for it by the very organization that had once celebrated his boldness. To him, it felt like exile. The media swarmed. They called Malcolm reckless, dangerous, heartless. But he didn't apologize. He clarified his words, saying he hadn't rejoiced in death, only pointed to a truth America didn't want to face. Still, the damage was done. And in that silence, Malcolm began reevaluating everything. What disturbed him most wasn't the press, it was the nation's response. Instead of standing by him, they distanced themselves. He felt abandoned. He had protected Elijah through scandal, defended the nation at every turn. And now, when he needed support, they turned their backs. The silence wasn't just strategic, it was personal. The 90-day suspension felt less like discipline and more like preparation for removal. During that period, Malcolm wasn't permitted to speak on behalf of the nation, travel for temple work, or address any gatherings. For a man whose identity had been shaped around his mission, that silence was suffocating. He remained obedient, but inside, the fire was growing. He didn't know what came next, but he knew things would never return to the way they were. Leaders inside the nation began spreading rumors, claiming Malcolm was trying to take over. The tension that had once simmered quietly now boiled into open hostility. Some former allies stopped returning his calls. Others warned him to watch his back. Malcolm was being erased in real time by the very family he had helped build. Still, he waited. He hoped Elijah would reach out, offer clarity, bridge the distance. But that call never came. Instead, word spread that the nation would be better off without him. Malcolm had become too outspoken, too unpredictable, too disillusioned. In private, he was already mourning the break before it was official. Then came the public cut. In March 1964, Malcolm X officially announced his departure from the Nation of Islam. The split wasn't just organizational, it was spiritual. He had given his life to the movement, but the movement no longer had space for him. The man who had once been its most loyal messenger had now become its most prominent exile. Malcolm didn't leave the nation lightly. He had defended it, built it, and lived it. Walking away felt like walking away from everything he knew. For weeks, he wrestled with the decision, questioning whether he had failed or if the movement had failed him. The heartbreak wasn't in the ideology, it was in the betrayal. He felt abandoned by the man he had once called a father. Elijah Muhammad had not only removed him from the movement, but also allowed others to discredit him publicly. Malcolm's loyalty had been treated like liability. The emotional weight of that rejection haunted him, even as he stood firm in his decision. He didn't show it on stage, but privately, the pain ran deep. Death threats followed. Some were anonymous. Others came from nation insiders he once trusted. He moved differently, more cautiously, but he refused to retreat. Malcolm had lost an institution, but he hadn't lost his voice. And now, for the first time, he would speak as a free man. The loss carved something raw inside him, but it also gave him clarity. He no longer had to defend contradictions. He no longer had to protect reputations. The separation forced him to confront who he was, outside of titles, ranks, and loyalty. What emerged was something leaner, sharper, and more dangerous than ever before. After leaving the nation, Malcolm didn't disappear. He reorganized. In March 1964, he founded Muslim Mosque Inc., a religious organization built on Islamic teachings, but independent from Elijah Muhammad's authority. He preached a more traditional form of Islam, one that welcomed international dialogue and spiritual growth. It was the beginning of a personal transformation, both theological and political. Malcolm wasn't turning his back on Islam. He was expanding his understanding of it. Shortly after, he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or OAAU. Inspired by the Organization of African Unity, Malcolm envisioned it as a secular, pan-African movement focused on human rights. It welcomed Black people of all faiths and backgrounds. Its mission was to fight systemic racism, not just in America, but globally. The shift was subtle but monumental. Malcolm was no longer just calling for Black nationalism, he was calling for global solidarity. With these two organizations, Malcolm had finally created space for every part of himself. The discipline of Islam, the urgency of political change, and the hunger for justice could now exist side by side. He traveled, studied, debated, and learned from others across the world. He was building something bigger than a movement. He was building a new identity. And for the first time, it wasn't borrowed. Malcolm wasn't trying to destroy the Nation of Islam, he was trying to grow beyond its limits. What he created in its place was messy, imperfect, but alive. And even though the walls were closing in, Malcolm walked forward with conviction. He had lost a home, but he had found his mission. 1964, Malcolm's Hajj to Mecca. The shift begins. In April 1964, just weeks after forming his own religious organization, Malcolm embarked on a journey that would change everything, his pilgrimage to Mecca. It was his first trip outside the United States, and he entered with expectations shaped by a lifetime of racial struggle. He believed Islam had truth, but he was still cautious about how religion functioned globally. He didn't go looking for change. He went to affirm his faith on a deeper level. What he encountered was far more than a ritual. From the moment he stepped onto foreign soil, Malcolm was disoriented, but in the best way. In Mecca, he wasn't followed by police or stared at with suspicion. He was welcomed as a brother. No one asked about his past. Everyone simply bowed toward the same direction, at the same time, in the same language. He completed the rites of Hajj like every other pilgrim. Barefoot, wrapped in white cloth, moving through the desert in sacred humility. He walked shoulder to shoulder with men from Turkey, Indonesia, Sudan, and Russia. He sat beside blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims who treated him not as a curiosity, but as family. For a man who had spent most of his life in a world divided by color, the experience pierced something deep. It opened a door he hadn't known was there. Malcolm didn't talk much at first. He watched, he prayed. And somewhere between the prayers, the silence, and the unity, his thinking began to shift. He started writing letters home, describing not just what he was seeing, but what it meant. This wasn't a political awakening, it was something more personal, the kind of change you don't plan for, but can't ignore. The most profound moment for Malcolm was not just Mecca itself, it was the people he met there. For the first time in his life, he saw white men and women praying beside black and brown Muslims without tension or hierarchy. It wasn't staged, it wasn't symbolic, it was real. And for Malcolm, that realness changed everything. He wrote home about sharing meals with people who, just months earlier, he would have seen as enemies. But here, in this sacred place, race didn't decide status. There were no segregated water fountains, no unspoken rules about where to sit or speak. People embraced him not as a political figure, but as a fellow believer. The experience stripped away the narratives he had carried since childhood. What Malcolm saw in Mecca wasn't perfection, but possibility. It challenged the idea that whiteness automatically meant oppression. It also showed him that Islam, when practiced with sincerity, could be a force for true brotherhood. He didn't abandon what he knew about America's deep racism. He simply realized that it didn't have to be universal. That truth was both comforting and confronting. He later said, "I have eaten from the same plate, drank from the same glass, and slept in the same bed, with people whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white." That sentence wasn't crafted for speeches. It came from a place of awe. It was a new kind of testimony, not angry, not defensive, just honest. That was new for Malcolm. As part of completing the pilgrimage, Malcolm took on a new name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. It was more than a title, it was a marker of rebirth. The Malcolm X name had been forged in the fire of resistance and identity reclamation. But El-Hajj Malik reflected a deeper transformation, one that was rooted in global faith, humility, and clarity. The name Malik means king in Arabic. El-Shabazz connected him to a mythic ancestral lineage he had once spoken of, now embraced with fuller understanding. By adding El-Hajj, he publicly committed to Islam in its truest international form. The name wasn't an abandonment of who he was, it was an expansion of it. Malcolm wasn't erasing Malcolm, he was stepping beyond him. Upon returning to Africa from Mecca, he insisted that reporters refer to him as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He wanted people to understand that this wasn't just a cosmetic change. It was an internal shift that deserved recognition. He had carried many names in his life: Malcolm Little, Detroit Red, Malcolm X, but this one was chosen freely, with spiritual intent. Still, not everyone understood the change. Some thought he had softened. Others thought he was confusing the message. But to Malcolm, clarity had never felt sharper. He hadn't lost his fire. He had simply found a better lens to aim it through. The name said as much as the speeches ever would. The Malcolm who returned from Hajj no longer saw civil rights as the full fight. He now called it a human rights issue, one that demanded global recognition, not just national reform. He began framing racism in America as part of a larger pattern of oppression seen across colonized nations. His message wasn't watered down, it was broadened, and it startled many who expected him to stay in his old lane. Malcolm spoke about white supremacy not as a genetic flaw, but as a system built and maintained for power. He made a distinction between individual white people and institutional racism. That nuance was new. It made some uncomfortable, but it made others listen more closely. He hadn't gone soft, he had gone wide. In speeches, he now referenced Algeria, Ghana, and South Africa, alongside Mississippi and Alabama. He talked about the struggle for dignity, sovereignty, and basic survival across the globe. By linking American racism to colonialism abroad, he created alliances that civil rights leaders hadn't fully tapped into. It was a smarter, deeper strategy, one rooted in global vision, not just national pain. He no longer believed that black people should completely separate from whites, but he did believe that true unity required truth. And truth, in Malcolm's world, always came first, no matter how uncomfortable. He didn't reject his past views, he refined them, And in that refinement, he found a voice the world hadn't heard before. Following Mecca, Malcolm spent weeks traveling across the Middle East and Africa. In every city, from Cairo to Lagos, he met with presidents, students, revolutionaries, and scholars. He wasn't there to lecture, he was there to learn, to listen, and to connect. And in those meetings, he realized how wide the fight for dignity truly was. He met with leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, both of whom saw Malcolm as more than a preacher. They saw him as a diplomat of the people. These weren't staged photo ops. These were real conversations about independence, liberation, and strategy. Malcolm was absorbing how post-colonial nations were rebuilding themselves after centuries of foreign rule. He visited Nigeria, where students gave him an honorary Yoruba name, Omowale, meaning the child has returned home. That moment moved him deeply. It wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual. He had spent years fighting to define himself in America. Now, in Africa, he felt affirmed without explanation. That sense of belonging fueled everything he did moving forward. Back in Harlem, he began encouraging African Americans to think globally. He urged them to see their struggle not as isolated, but as part of a global pattern of exploitation. The US government saw this and grew more concerned. Malcolm wasn't just a domestic threat now. He was international, and that made him harder to contain. When Malcolm returned to the US, the difference in his tone was noticeable. He still spoke with urgency, but now it carried a calm precision that caught people off guard. He was measured, deliberate, and deeply focused. Reporters who expected the old Firebrand found a man speaking like a statesman. The message hadn't softened, but the delivery had matured. In interviews, he no longer called all white people devils. Instead, he spoke of systems, power structures, and moral accountability. He made room for nuance. For the first time, he said publicly that there were white people who wanted justice and were willing to fight for it. That shift didn't mean he trusted easily, but it meant he had hope. He gave one of his most famous interviews to a Canadian journalist, calmly explaining the difference between the Nation of Islam's theology and his evolving worldview. He emphasized unity across cultures, but always on the foundation of truth and self-determination. He didn't dodge hard questions, he welcomed them. And for once, the media started portraying him with more complexity. Audiences noticed the change too. They leaned in differently. Malcolm wasn't shouting from the margins anymore. He was stepping into the center of the global conversation. And whether people agreed or not, they listened. Because they sensed this man had seen something most of them never would. But with this new vision came new enemies. While Malcolm was gaining global allies, he was losing security at home. The Nation of Islam viewed him as a traitor. His open criticisms of Elijah Muhammad and the organization's direction had made reconciliation impossible. And worse, some members took it personally. He began receiving threats, anonymous phone calls, letters, even direct confrontations. His house was being watched, his phones were tapped. The FBI had already been tracking him, but now it wasn't just federal agents. Former comrades had become enemies, and Malcolm knew it. He told friends, "I don't expect to live long." He moved cautiously, changing his routines, traveling with a small circle of loyal followers. But he refused to live in fear. When asked if he was afraid of dying, he said, "I believe in Islam. I don't fear death." Still, the tension followed him everywhere he went. Through crowds, into auditoriums, even into mosques. Even in the midst of transformation, Malcolm was walking a tightrope. He had more clarity than ever, but less protection. And he knew that speaking truth, especially as a free black man with global support, was a dangerous thing in America. But he kept speaking anyway, because for Malcolm, truth was never negotiable, even when it came with a target. Malcolm's family under threat. In the final months of Malcolm's life, the threats against him became relentless and impossible to ignore. His wife, El-Shabazz, received calls at home that made her hands shake when she hung up the phone. Their daughters, still young, started to sense that the adults were afraid in ways no one could explain. Malcolm didn't try to hide the danger from them, but he did try to soften it. He kept repeating that no matter what happened to him, they had to stay strong. But every morning he left the house, Betty wondered if he'd come back. Their home in Queens was targeted more than once, vandalized, and watched by men they couldn't always see. In February 1965, just days before his death, someone firebombed the house in the dark of night. Flames ripped through the nursery and scorched the walls as Malcolm and Betty scrambled to get the children out. They barely escaped. Standing outside in the cold, holding his crying daughters, Malcolm knew the line between warning and action had disappeared. He was no longer just a man under suspicion. He was a man marked for death. Even then, Malcolm refused to go into hiding. He told friends and reporters that he wouldn't be chased away from his purpose. He said if anything happened to him, it would only prove his point about the lengths people would go to silence the truth. But he was no longer naive about where the threat was coming from. He suspected the Nation of Islam, but also believed government forces had a hand in escalating tensions. He was surrounded by enemies and still chose to stand in the open. Those final weeks were filled with preparation and dread. He moved his family from house to house, trying to keep them safe, but no place felt secure anymore. His children watched him pack and repack bags, never explaining in detail, but never lying either. Malcolm once told Betty, "If I die for what I believe." It was the only promise he could still keep. As February unfolded, Malcolm started saying out loud what he had only whispered before. In interviews and speeches, he spoke openly about the possibility of his own murder. He told reporters, "I am a marked man." He looked them in the eye, unflinching, as he described how betrayal and fear were closing in. Some thought he was exaggerating. Others saw a man finally telling the truth without a filter. He said, "I know what they're going to do to me," as if it was a fact, not a fear. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Those close to him noticed a difference in his voice when he talked about death. It wasn't bravado, it was acceptance. He began making arrangements for his family, making sure Betty knew where to find documents, contacts, and money. He was preparing for the end while still fighting for a future. The tension wasn't hidden anymore. It followed him into every room. Malcolm understood that every time he stepped on a stage, he might not walk off alive. He wore that knowledge without drama, but also without denial. Friends asked him why he kept going, why he didn't flee or step back. He always said the same thing: "If I stop now, it means everything I've said was a lie." He refused bodyguards he didn't trust, relying instead on a handful of loyal supporters who were as afraid as he was. Even when he smiled, the exhaustion showed. It wasn't just fear that wore on him. It was the sense that all his warnings were coming true, and yet he kept showing up because silence had never been an option. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan to deliver what would be his final speech. The room was filled with families, supporters, and journalists, all packed into rows of folding chairs under bright lights. He stood behind the podium, calm but alert, scanning faces he had seen for years. He was scheduled to speak about unity and the future of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, but the air was thick with something unspoken. Everyone knew he was a man living on borrowed time. He began by greeting the crowd with "Assalamu alaikum," his voice steady. He spoke about the need to take the black struggle to international forums, about human rights over civil rights, and about reclaiming dignity. His words were measured, clear, and surprisingly hopeful given the threats that surrounded him. He didn't talk about death that day, but every sentence carried the weight of someone who understood how close it was. He paused more than usual, as if choosing each word carefully. At one point, a disturbance broke out near the back of the hall. A man yelled, "Get your hand out of my pocket," a phrase that would later be debated in countless investigations. Malcolm looked up, startled, but he didn't step back. For a split second, the room went silent, everyone frozen in confusion. Then, chaos erupted. Gunshots cracked through the hall as people screamed and ducked for cover. Malcolm fell backward onto the stage, struck multiple times. His aides rushed to his side as his wife cried out from the audience. In that moment, everything he had warned about became reality. The attack lasted less than 15 seconds, but it felt endless to everyone in the room. 3 men fired at Malcolm from different angles, their bullets hitting him in the chest and legs. Witnesses described the noise as deafening, a sound that seemed to swallow the hall. Betty ran toward the stage, shielding her children as chaos unfolded around her. Malcolm lay on his back, eyes open but unseeing, as the last breaths left his body. The assassins tried to escape, but were grabbed and beaten by the crowd before police arrived. The scene was confusion and rage, grief and horror mixing in the air. For years, Malcolm had warned that his life would end this way. Even so, people were stunned that it happened in broad daylight, in front of witnesses and cameras. Emergency crews carried his body away as news spread like wildfire across the city. Reporters scrambled to get statements while friends and followers tried to process the loss. Outside, crowds began to gather, some weeping openly, others standing in stunned silence. Within hours, headlines declared Malcolm X dead at 39. The man who had redefined black activism had been silenced with the same violence he had spent his life exposing. But even in death, his influence was already taking root in ways no bullet could stop. Police cordoned off the ballroom, collecting shell casings and taking witness statements. But the questions began immediately. Who ordered the killing and why? The answers would prove more complicated than anyone in that room could have imagined. 3 men were eventually arrested and charged with Malcolm's murder. Talmadge Hayer was caught at the scene, while Norman, 3X Butler, and Thomas, 15X Johnson, were named as accomplices. The trial was swift and highly publicized, with prosecutors arguing that Nation of Islam insiders had carried out the assassination. Hayer confessed but insisted the other 2 were innocent, a claim that would haunt the case for decades. Despite the doubts, all 3 were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. It was a resolution that never felt complete. Over the years, journalists and historians kept digging into the investigation. They found gaps in police work, missing evidence, and witness statements that didn't match the prosecution's story. Hayer maintained that Butler and Johnson had nothing to do with the plot. Decades later, renewed investigations would uncover FBI records and hidden documents, suggesting the full truth had been buried. In 2021, after years of advocacy, the convictions of Butler and Johnson were formally overturned. The state admitted the men had likely been framed. For Malcolm's family, the exoneration was bittersweet. They had always suspected the official story wasn't the whole story, but the truth came too late for the men who lost decades behind bars. It also left a darker question. If innocent men went to prison, who else had a hand in Malcolm's killing? And why was the public kept in the dark for so long? The wrongful convictions became another chapter in a legacy already marked by betrayal and injustice. They proved that Malcolm's warnings about the length's power would go to silence dissent weren't paranoia. They were prophecy. And in the end, even the courts had to admit it. Behind the headlines in courtrooms, another story was unfolding. FBI files would later confirm that Malcolm had been under near constant surveillance for years. COINTELPRO, the agency's secret counterintelligence program, saw him as a threat that needed to be neutralized. Agents infiltrated his meetings, tapped his phones, and followed his movements. They weren't just watching. They were actively working to sow division between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam. It was a strategy designed to weaken black leadership from the inside out. Documents revealed that informants were placed close to Malcolm during his final months. Some of them fed information to both the FBI and the NYPD, creating a web of manipulation he never fully escaped. These efforts didn't pull the trigger, but they did everything else. They fueled distrust, amplified rivalries, and made it easier for others to act violently. And when Malcolm was killed, those same agencies were quick to wash their hands of responsibility. Even as the government publicly condemned the assassination, behind closed doors, they saw it as a problem solved. The man who had dared to call out American hypocrisy on the world stage was gone, but the paper trail they left behind told a different story. One of deliberate sabotage and cold calculation. It showed that Malcolm's warnings about surveillance were never exaggerated. His death was more than a personal loss. It was the result of a system determined to silence him before his vision grew any larger. The same government that claimed to protect democracy had worked in the shadows to stop a man from practicing it. And history would not let them forget it. In the days after Malcolm's death, his funeral drew thousands of mourners from across the country. They came to Harlem's Faith Temple Church to pay their respects to a man who had once been called a menace. El-Shabazz stood with her daughters, dignified in her grief, accepting condolences from strangers and friends alike. Ossie Davis, the actor and activist, delivered a eulogy that captured what so many felt but couldn't say. He called Malcolm our own black shining prince, a man who did not hesitate to die because he loved us so. The words rang through the sanctuary like a final declaration. Outside, crowds stretched for blocks. Some held photographs of Malcolm in his nation days. Others clutched newspaper clippings about his final speeches. People cried, argued, and prayed, struggling to make sense of what had been taken from them. Even those who had disagreed with him recognized the size of the loss. He had been fearless in a way that forced others to re-examine themselves. And now, without him, the movement felt both wounded and determined. Critics were quick to paint Malcolm as a man who sowed violence, but even they couldn't ignore the power he had wielded with words alone. Journalists and scholars began re-evaluating his life almost immediately. Was he a radical or a visionary? A divisive figure or a necessary challenger? The debate never stopped. And in some ways, that was Malcolm's final victory. His family carried on, refusing to let his death define his story. Betty raised their daughters with the same pride Malcolm had taught her to claim. Followers founded new organizations, inspired by his insistence that dignity must come before acceptance. And across generations, his voice continued to echo, clear, unbroken, and unafraid. The man they tried to erase with bullets became a symbol that traveled farther than they ever imagined. His voice, once dismissed as dangerous, now echoes across continents, from African parliaments to student protests, from prisons to poetry slams. Liberation movements in South Africa, Palestine, and Latin America studied his fire, not to imitate it, but to understand its source. He showed the oppressed how to speak without apology, and he reminded the powerful that silence was never safety. In America, his name became a blueprint. The Black Power movement carried his urgency. Hip-hop carried his language. Black Lives Matter carried his demand for truth. He never lived to see his image on murals or his words quoted by presidents. But the streets remember, so do the children named after him. Today, people repeat his words in tweets, protests, and classroom debates, often without knowing who he really was. Ironically, some of the same institutions that once branded him a threat now cite him in diversity trainings. But Malcolm didn't belong to any side. He stood where conscience lived, and that space was never comfortable. He wasn't just ahead of his time, he was ahead of our comfort.